You're in the rant wormhole where I go when it's too cold to rant in the rant hole. Where I rant about whatever my $15 a month plus patrons want me to rant about. You can get a rant yourself by becoming one of those people. Today, I'm going to rant about Mind Game at the request of, I think, Meme Manifest. I don't know how I remembered that, but I don't have my laptop in front of me at the moment. I actually just rewatched Mind Game last night just for the sake of this fucking rant, so I hope you appreciate it. But Mind Game was the first film directed by Masaaki Yuasa back in 2004. I have become a big fan of this director over the years. I was not at the time. I first saw this movie in, I think, 2007. On Crunchyroll before it was legal, back when you couldn't full screen without an account. So I'm sure I watched it in a shitty little 240p window, and it left very little impression on me at the time. I just thought it was like a bunch of trippy nonsense. Rewatching it, I enjoyed it a lot more. I feel as though the movie is basically an attempt to take a like James Joyce-esque stream of consciousness novel writing style and adapt that into anime. And insofar as accomplishing that, I think it does a great job. There's just lots of interesting pacing of scenes that happens where sometimes you have like a whole like lifetime worth of images blasting by in like just a couple of seconds to just give you like impressions of someone's life all the way through and kind of inform you of what kind of person this is and what kind of world they inhabit just by way of like rapid images. And then that happens like at the beginning and end of the movie and in certain scenes throughout. But most of it is more concentrated on lengthy scenes that will often hold on really interesting camera angles and have the character sort of move through the depth of the shot as opposed to moving the shot itself, which is something that Masaaki Yuasa does a lot in his animation, especially in his early work. If you've seen his work on films like Shin-chan or Chibi Maruko-san from before he had a directorial debut, they are more similar to Mind Game than the stuff he's done since then. I think his style has evolved considerably, and it's kind of funny watching this movie and then thinking about the first half of it, which all takes place in like just a couple of hours, really, in comparison to The Night is Short, Walk On Girl, which similarly is like following these characters just through the events that transpire in a single night, and how they both kind of have the same train of thought style of filmmaking, but Night is Short just has taken it to such a new level and a new extreme of like speed and of uniqueness and of like not dwelling on anything too much. This movie, Mind Game, has certain scenes that I felt went on too long. Like they were engrossing, but it felt like there was almost too much detail, too much dwelling on things that aren't really progressing the narrative in any kind of interesting way or adding anything new. A lot of this movie is full of like scatological humor and just like very the characters are sort of instinct driven. There's a lot of just like very base, sex, violence, those kind of thoughts brought to the surface, and it's about characters who are sort of dumb. Like most of the main cast are stupid people who make bad decisions and are sort of following their instincts to too great of an extent, which I think is part of the point. It's sort of about a character who hasn't really accomplished anything in his life. He has a lot of ambitions but no real drive and hasn't really completed anything. And then after he is murdered in this very bizarre scene that feels like it was sort of Tarantino-esque, but not nearly as good as a scene in a Tarantino film, but like it felt like from that school of movies that was sort of trying to be like Tarantino for a little while. And after he gets killed, he manages to sort of dupe God and come back to life. And, basically is like, I'm going to take everything I want this time. Which immediately he drives himself into, like, the worst possible position by just following his gut, but his gut is obviously stupid. So, most of the movie, like the first half of it, is basically introducing us to the characters and their situation and putting them into this really bizarre scenario before driving them into the belly of a whale. And they spend pretty much the whole second half of the movie inside the belly of this whale. And sort of what the movie is about is putting yourself into a position where when you aren't so concerned about the world and like your place within it and keeping up appearances or living up to a certain standard, when you find yourself in a position where you can't do anything because you're literally trapped and all that there is to focus on is just coming to terms with yourself and sort of finding fulfillment in just living and not in necessarily like what you've done, but just like, you know, finding some self-assuredness and like believing in yourself in those circumstances, then you can find this sort of refreshment that allows you to take on your life again, you know, and to just come at it from a different angle. And that's sort of what happens to the characters, is that, you know, they realize sort of how petty the things that they cared about were, and after finding enjoyment living inside of this belly of a whale and really living out the best time of their lives, of like, you know, having everything stripped away except for self-betterment, once they've reached a point where they're ready to face society again, that's when they finally escape, re-emerge, and we get like a crazy montage of them living out the rest of their lives. So that's basically the core emotional content of the film, which is not really that much. Like, that stuff, it's explored, I get, like, it's explored enough that you get that that's the point, and I mean, it's kind of even spelled out in the dialogue at one point. But like, there's nothing additionally to the movie. It doesn't really have a whole lot of engrossing themes, and I don't think that it explores those themes in the most interesting way it could. It's basically just, how do we make a stream of consciousness that tells this story, and it's more about like the presentation than it is about like whether or not those themes are particularly interesting or, you know, on any in an inherent way. So like, most of the movie is just crazy trippy scenes, and some of them are really good. Sometimes the movie slows down a bit, and when it gets into moments where the momentum isn't really held up, that's when you start to realize you don't care that much. You know, like, there's a sort of low point when the characters are coming to terms with the fact that they're trapped inside the belly of this whale, which I think was mostly meant to give a greater sense of time to how long they're in there and really let the situation sink in with some degree of seriousness, but that's where the movie kind of gets boring. And again, it spends a lot of time in certain scenes where there's nothing really new happening intellectually. It's just cool imagery and wacky, you know, wacky presentation. Yeah, you'll see some things in this movie you won't see elsewhere, and there's definitely a lot to value in that. There's some really unique use of multimedia style. Aesthetically, the film looks incredible for being a 2004 film. I mean, obviously there's a lot of people who are just going to think it looks like shit because they don't like the design sensibilities, but like, there's tons of really memorable shots, tons of unique use of CG that, you know, is always puts aesthetic over detail, which is important, you know, especially at a time when CG was not nearly being used as much to the extent that it is now, especially in anime. So yeah, I think it's very much an artistic accomplishment. It's a very bold statement. It's probably the weirdest of Masaaki Yuasa's already weird catalog, but I do think it prioritized weirdness over goodness, and his later work is all better in terms of telling better stories, using the unique aesthetic for, you know, to explore deeper themes and a wider variety of themes, and, you know, like, stream of consciousness is all well and fine. I write that way a lot. I like a lot of stream of consciousness stories, so, like, I have no problem with that, you know, as a storytelling style, but this is not that interesting of one, you know. It's like, anybody can have a stream of consciousness where they go to all these very base places, and there's nothing, you know, there's nothing impressive about that. It's just kind of a way of doing things. I think if I wanted to watch like a crude, absurd, crazy, over-the-top thing, I would prefer to watch Dead Leaves by, you know, Hiroyuki Maishi over this movie, because that one's even more aesthetically bombastic and more, even though it's not as experimental as this movie, it's more cohesive and just better. So yeah, Mind Game, I'd say give it a watch. If you like crazy, unique art house shit, you probably have seen it already. You know, if you are a fan of Masaaki Yuasa and you want to track his evolution, it's worth watching for that reason. I think a lot of people will really hate this movie because it is, you know, mostly scatological nonsense. But I think that the deftness with which it can shift tones and do those tones pretty well is commendable at the very least. So there you go.